Asher came to after hitting the iron floor of the vestibule. His ears were ringing. He tasted blood in his mouth. Two guards from the third car were holding his arms and dragging him toward the coupler. Ahead, the open door to the platform clattered. Beyond the door stretched a gray wasteland and a low crimson sky. The train was traveling at full speed. There was less than an hour left until the night stop. Asher realized where they were dragging him. People weren't put on trial for stealing a ration. People were simply left at the station when night fell. And at night, monsters came out at the station. He tried to remember how it all began. His memory came back in fits and starts. That morning, 3 boxes of dried protein were missing from the distribution car. The storekeeper pointed the finger at him. Asher had been working as a loader at the warehouse for 2 months already. He hauled boxes and kept quiet. He was a convenient scapegoat. No family, no car, no patron. The crowd in the aisle shouted and demanded that the thief be thrown out. Someone hit him on the back of the head. Then there was a blackout, and now he was on the vestibule floor. The guard on the left told his partner that they hadn't even bothered with an interrogation. The order came from the merchandise car, from Dolan Craig himself. Asher clenched his teeth. Now it all made sense. 3 boxes of protein cost as much as 40 rounds of ammunition. The storekeeper sold them on the black market and pinned it on the porter, and Craig signed the death warrant without a second thought. One less mouth to feed. The train didn't like extra mouths. The 77-car train had been trudging through the dead world for 6 years now. Every evening it stopped at a nameless station. Every night, creatures stirred to life around the station. Every morning the train moved on. No one knew where. No one knew why. The people knew only one rule. Whoever remained on the platform after sunset would never board the train. The guards dragged Asher to the very edge of the platform. The wind whipped sand into his face, and then the fingers of his right hand felt a hard, cold object in the lining of his jacket, a brass key. Asher froze. He had forgotten about the key. A week ago, old man Tobias Friend was dying in the infirmary car. Asher had been hauling water there in exchange for half a ration. The old man had been the train's last cook. He'd once run the dining car, but the business had gone under in its very first year. People stopped paying for food when food became currency. On his last night, Tobias grabbed Asher by the sleeve. He asked who Asher had been before the disaster. Asher replied that he'd been a cook at a late-night diner. The old man looked at him for a long time. Then he placed a brass key in his palm and said that car 34 was now his. He said that the stove chooses by the hands, and Asher had the hands of a cook. He said one more strange thing. He said that the stove in there was older than the train. In the morning, the old man died. Asher sewed the key into the lining of his jacket and forgot about it. No one needed the dead restaurant. Now the key was the only thing standing between him and the platform. Asher shouted through the wind that he was the keeper of the key. The guards stopped. The law of the train knew few prohibitions, but one was ironclad. A car carrying a living keyholder is inviolable, and a keyholder cannot be removed without a trial by the Council of Cars. This law was written in blood during the first year. Back then, the engineers uncoupled 2 cars full of rebels, and since then, every car has become a small state. The guard on the right ordered him not to lie. Asher tore the lining with his teeth and spat the key into his palm. The number 34 was stamped on the brass, along with a brand in the shape of a tongue of flame. The guards exchanged glances. A mark like that couldn't be forged. Everyone on the train recognized the mark of the hearth. The senior guard cursed and said the captain of the guard would decide. They dragged Asher back through the cars. People in the aisles stared at him as if he were a corpse that had risen and started walking. In the command compartment of the 9th car, they threw him onto a bench. A woman in a gray coat with an arrow patch sat down across from him. Guard Captain Senta Marlowe. It was said that she had shot her own brother when he brought the infection into the car. Senta twirled the key between her fingers. She asked where the porter had gotten the cook's key. Asher told her about the old man. Senta asked if he knew how to cook. Asher said that before the disaster, he'd spent 6 years at the stove. Senta stared at him for a long time, her expression blank. Then she said that the law is the law. The key holder gets the car. But she added that the theft charge hadn't gone away. The car council would review the case in 10 days. If in 10 days, car 34 didn't prove its usefulness to the train, the council would decide that the key had fallen into the thief's hands by accident, and then he'd be kicked off the train. She said this in a flat voice, like a schedule. Asher asked what counted as a benefit. Senta replied that a benefit was something people were willing to pay for. She tossed him the key and told him to get out. Car number 34 was parked in the middle of the train, between the living quarters and the engine room. The door was sealed with wire. Asher twisted the wire and inserted the key. The lock turned smoothly, as if it had been oiled yesterday. Inside, it smelled of cold iron and dust. The light of sunset streamed through the cloudy windows onto 2 rows of tables. 12 tables, 48 seats. A bar counter ran along the wall. Behind the counter was the kitchen. Asher walked behind the counter and stopped. The stove was unlike any other stove he had ever seen. A black cast iron beast with 6 burners, an oven, and an open hearth beneath it. The same mark as on the key was stamped on the hearth damper, a tongue of flame. Asher ran his hand over the cold cast iron, and the cast iron responded. Beneath the damper, the coals began to smolder on their own. Asher pulled his hand back. The fire flared up evenly and silently, and then glowing lines appeared on the soot-stained wall above the stove. Asher read them aloud, and his throat went dry. The seal of the hearth had recognized its new keeper. Food cooked over this fire restores the eater's strength. The strength of the effect depends on the keeper's skill and the quality of the ingredients. The hearth accepts payment and issues orders. A table appeared below the lines. Keeper level 1. There are 3 known recipes: survivor's stew, traveler's flatbread, and dried herb tea. Asher stood there staring at the glowing letters until they faded. He didn't believe in miracles. Over the 6 years of the apocalypse, he had seen monsters, curses, and people who were worse than monsters. But a miracle stood before him, its coals burning quietly. He rummaged through the kitchen. In the cupboards, he found Old Man Tobias's dishes and knives. The knives were well maintained. In the pantry, he found some leftovers: half a sack of gray flour, a bundle of dried herbs, and a jar of salt. 3 shriveled onions, a chunk of hard lard. Asher had had nothing but blood in his mouth since morning. His hands set to work on their own. He melted the lard. He sautéed the onions. He poured in water from the titanium canteen. He tossed in the herbs and salt and a handful of flour to thicken it. The kitchen filled with a scent this train car hadn't smelled in 5 years. Asher ladled some soup into a tin bowl and sat down at the counter. The first spoonful burned his tongue. The second sank into his stomach like a warm stone. And with the third, he felt the pain in the back of his head ease. He touched the back of his head. The cut had healed. The swelling was gone. The lines appeared above the stove again. Survivor's soup. Average quality. Minimal recovery. 1 eater. Asher slowly scraped the bowl clean. Then he laughed in the empty car, and his laugh came out hoarse and angry. 10 days. Senta had given him 10 days to prove his worth. He looked at the 12 empty tables, at the smoldering hearth, at his own cook's hands. Usefulness is what people are willing to pay for. Well then, he knew exactly one thing that people paid for always and everywhere, until the end of the world and beyond. Outside the window, the wasteland was engulfed in darkness. The train began to slow down. Ahead, the night station loomed out of the twilight. Asher blew out the lamp and stood by the window. He had never before seen a stop from a separate car. The platform emerged from the darkness as a gray strip, rusty posts, a broken canopy, and beyond the platform, in the dead city, pairs of green lights were already coming on. Eyes. Hundreds of eyes. The creatures were coming out to the train just as they come to a river to drink. They couldn't cross the platform's boundary. No one knew why. Asher stood and looked at the green lights, and the green lights looked back at him. Then there was a knock on the train car door. 3 knocks, steady and heavy. Asher froze. No one came to visit on the train before dawn. The knocking repeated. From behind the door, a woman's voice said that a guard had seen through the window how the porter's shattered skull had healed, and that she wanted to know what that smell was in the dead car. Asher didn't open the door right away. First, he asked through the metal who was standing outside. The voice replied that it was Private Pia Lark from the escort detail. According to regulations, during the night stop, a guard patrolled the train every 2 hours. Asher slid the bolt back. Standing in the doorway was a petite girl of about 20, with a carbine slung over her back and a flashlight in her hand. Her left cheek was drawn tight by an old burn scar. She stepped inside, sniffed the air, and her face took on a helpless expression. She said it smelled just like her grandmother's house did before the disaster. Then she caught herself and reminded herself aloud that she'd come on business. She said she'd seen him that afternoon in the command module with a broken head, and that evening, through the window, she'd seen him unharmed. She asked point blank if he was treating the wounds. Asher decided not to lie. The guard would find out first anyway, and lying to the guard would cost him dearly. He said it wasn't him who was healing the wounds, but the food from this hearth. Pia looked at him as if he were shell-shocked. Asher ladled a scoop of soup into a bowl and set it on the counter. He said the first serving was on the house. Pia stared at the bowl for a long time. Then she took off her glove. On the back of her hand, a fresh cut from yesterday's loading was turning dark. She ate 6 spoonfuls of soup, choking and burning herself. On the last spoonful, the cut on her hand glowed with a faint, warm light and closed up. Pia dropped the spoon. She sat there, staring at her hand and rubbing it with her finger. Then she looked up and asked how much it cost. Asher realized that this question would decide everything right then and there. He couldn't jack up the price. An inflated price would turn the diner into a pharmacy for the rich, and the rich on the train were already divided among the clans. Nor could the price be lowered. A free miracle would be trampled underfoot within a week. He said that a bowl of soup cost 1 cartridge or an equivalent exchange. Pia said that a cartridge was a private guard's daily pay. Asher replied that the soup restores strength, for which the infirmary charges 10. Pia placed a cartridge on the counter and asked for a second bowl to take with her for her partner, whose bones ached after a grueling shift. In the morning, the train set off, and by noon, the first strangers arrived in car 34. Rumors on the train spread faster than the train itself. 2 oilers arrived with steam burns. A woman arrived with a child who had a persistent cough. An old patrolman arrived with a back that wouldn't bend. Asher cooked, fried, and kept track of everything. Half a sack of flour was disappearing before his eyes. By evening, he had 9 cartridges, 2 coal tokens, and a spool of thread, and he was almost out of food. And then Senta Marlowe arrived. The captain of the guard sat down at the far table with her back to the wall, the way people sit who trust no one. She ordered a flatbread and tea. Asher could see that she wasn't eating but testing it. She broke off a piece, chewed it, looked at her fingers. 3 days ago, she'd caught a chill in her shoulder on the roof of the train car, and Asher had seen her being careful with her right hand that afternoon at headquarters. Now she slowly raised her right hand above her head. She lowered it. Her expression hadn't changed, but she placed 3 bullets on the table instead of 2. She said that's what a benefit looks like. Then she added without pause that a benefit on the train always finds an owner quickly. She said the dining car had already asked about the snack bar, and she left. Senta was wrong only about the timing. The owner didn't come tomorrow. He came that very night. During the evening stop, 3 men entered the car. 2 broad, silent porters stood by the door. The third walked between the tables, running his finger along the tabletops as if checking for dust. Dolan Craig was a short, neat man with a soft voice and eyes the color of murky water. Half the train's shops paid him a cut. Asher looked at the man who, with a single signature yesterday, had sent him to the platform. Craig didn't remember the signature. To him, it was a shipping document, not a person. He said he was glad to see a new venture on board. He said that a new venture always involved risks, fire, spoiled goods, dissatisfied customers with knives. He said that Craig's trading company, in exchange for a modest cut of half the revenue, would take on all these risks itself, and at the same time supply the goods at its own prices. Asher asked what would happen if he refused. Craig smiled and said that then there would be even more risks. He placed a dried fish on the counter as a gesture of goodwill and left. Asher stood looking at the fish and understood the situation. The goods on the train came through 3 channels: the greenhouses in the 7th car, hunting expeditions at the stops, and Craig's warehouses, where everything else ended up. Craig controlled the greenhouses through debt, the hunters through buyouts. If Asher refused, his supply of flour and lard would run out for good. And without food, the hearth is just a warm piece of cast iron. He looked at the glowing display above the stove. The display had changed over the course of the day. Keeper level. 1. Eaters fed, 26. 14 eaters until level 2. And below that hung a new line that Asher couldn't take his eyes off for a long time. The hearth accepts special ingredients. Meat and body parts of creatures from the night world are fit for consumption after being processed on the seals. The creatures' properties are transferred to the dishes. Asher remembered the green eyes beyond the platform. Everyone on the train knew that the meat of those creatures was poison and madness. 2 daredevils in their 4th year boiled a bone hound and were gnawing at the walls by morning. But they'd cooked it over an ordinary fire. He stepped out into the vestibule. The train was taking its usual break. The signal lights were burning along the platform. At the edge of the boundary, hunters from the 19th car stood, shooting creatures across the line, picking out those that came close. They hooked the carcasses with hooks and hauled them back over the line for the bones and hides. The bones were used for glue. The hides were made into belts. The meat was thrown away. Asher approached the senior hunter. The senior hunter's name was Garm, and he was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. Asher asked how much they were selling the greyhound's meat for. Garm snorted and asked if the cook was planning to poison the passengers. Asher said he'd pay 2 rounds for the tenderloin if Garm kept quiet. Garm agreed to keep quiet for 3. That night, Asher stood over a piece of dark meat streaked with tin-colored veins. The seal above the stove glowed evenly. He placed the meat on the cast iron griddle. The flame beneath the burner changed color from red to white. A scent unlike anything else wafted through the car. The display flashed. Special ingredient detected. Greyhound meat. Ability. Twilight vision. Processing possible. Required skill level achieved. Asher cooked it just as he would have cooked venison, with salt and his last onion. Then he cut off a slice, looked at it, and thought that if he'd made a mistake, he'd be gnawing on the walls by morning. He ate the whole slice. The world didn't start spinning. On the contrary, it came into sharp focus. Asher blew out the lamp and froze. He could see the dark train car as clearly as on a cloudy midday. Every table, every crack. The effect lasted about an hour. When his vision returned to normal, Asher sat down at the counter and began to think differently. Soup for a cartridge is survival, but a dish that gives a guard night vision during a patrol? That's not food, that's equipment. Equipment is paid for with weapons and maps. In the morning, he gave Pia a chunk of roasted hound and asked her to eat it before her night patrol and tell the captain what she saw. And by evening, Senta Marlowe arrived at car 34 with an assistant who was carrying a flat box under his arm. Inside the box lay a staff map of the route, 10 rounds of ammunition, and a hunter's knife. Senta said that the guard was ordering 6 portions of twilight meat for each nightly stop. She said that this wasn't friendship, it was a contract. As she reached the doorway, she paused and added that Craig had bought up all the carcasses for the week ahead from the hunters in car number 19 that morning. Asher looked at his storeroom, where the last piece of hunter's meat lay. He had a contract with the guard. He didn't have the ingredients for the contract. Asher spread out a staff map on the counter and thought until the middle of the night. Craig had cut him off from the hunters in the 19th car, but the hunters in the 19th car weren't the only ones standing at the edge of the platform. There were also the tail cars. The last 8 cars of the train were called the tail, and the people there lived the worst of all. For 6 years, debtors, the sick, and undesirables had been exiled there. The tail cars had no greenhouses or storage facilities. They had only their hands and hunger, and at every stop, they hunted animals on their side of the platform with homemade spears because they had no ammunition. Craig himself bought their bones and hides for a quarter of the price. No one went to the tail. It was believed that people were stabbed there for their jackets. In the morning, Asher filled his shoulder bag with flatbread and a pot of soup and walked back through the train. At the border of the 70th car, 2 guys with sharpened sticks stopped him. Asher said he was looking for the leader and that he'd come with food, not to collect debts. The leader of the tail turned out to be a woman named Odra, with a gray braid and the eyes of someone who had buried more people than she had fed. She listened to him in silence. Asher proposed a simple arrangement.
The tail-end crew would give him the meat from the animals they were going to throw away anyway. For each carcass, he would pay not with money, but with a hot, nourishing meal from the hearth. Audra asked what the catch was. Asher replied that there were two catches. The first was that Craig would put pressure on everyone who traded with car 34. The second was that the tail-enders would have to haul the carcasses through half the train. Audra smirked and said that Craig had already taken everything he could from the tail end. Then she ordered bowls to be brought. Asher ladled out the stew in front of 50 people. He watched the tail-end workers eat. They ate slowly. They ate as if they were afraid the food would be taken away halfway through. The boy with a festering scrape on his forehead had the wound right above his bowl, and when Audra saw it, her braid twitched. The deal was made without any paperwork. The tail end didn't trust paper. Audra simply shook his hand and said that the Vost remembers both the good and the bad for equally long. That same night, the tail folk dragged 3 carcasses of greyhounds and one of a bonehound to him. The seal accepted them all. The bonehound's meat imparted the property of tough skin. For half an hour, cuts and bruises simply didn't appear on the eater. The guard valued the tough skin even more highly than twilight vision. 3 days later, there was a line of 24 people waiting for the snack bar to open. Asher raised his keeper level to 2, and the table unlocked the 4th recipe for him, baked root with herbs. And a new line that was more important than the recipe itself. The hearth is capable of removing induced curses. It requires a dish of at least average quality and a special ingredient linked to the source of the curse. Asher reread the line 3 times. Curses were the train's second torment after the beasts. At the stops, the beasts couldn't cross the line, but their gazes and howls could. People caught the curse through windows and cracks. A withering hand, black insomnia, a whisper at the nape of the neck. The infirmary staved off the curse with poppy decoction and straps. No one knew how to lift it. The curse found Asher on its own. On the 5th day, 2 men entered the car, carrying a third. They were carrying him from the direction of the lead cars, from the mechanics section. The man's eyes were closed, and his lips moved ceaselessly. The chief mechanic said that a week ago, at the layover, his brother had stared at a white creature on the platform and hadn't slept since, muttering numbers. The infirmary refused to treat him. Dr. Yule said that black insomnia burns a person out in a month. Asher asked what the white creature looked like. The engineer described a long creature resembling a scruffy heron with mirror-like eyes. Asher recalled a line about an ingredient linked to the source. He said he'd try to help but needed a part of such a creature, at least a feather. The mechanics exchanged glances, and the senior one said that white herons rarely come out onto the platform and don't come close. Asher went to see Audra. Audra listened and said that Tail had seen a white heron the day before yesterday on the north side, and that the attempt would cost blood because a spear wouldn't reach the heron. Help came from where Asher least expected it. Pia overheard the conversation at the diner, and that evening brought her partner, who had a sniper scope mounted on his carbine. She said that the guard couldn't officially take on private contracts. Then she added that the guard could officially practice shooting at dangerous targets. They waited in the parking lot until just past midnight. The white heron emerged from the ruins as dawn broke. It moved like a reflection on water. Pia's partner took it down with a single shot from 200 paces. The tail men hauled the carcass in with hooks. Asher simmered a broth from the white heron until dawn. The seal burned with a white flame. The table indicated the property lucid dream. He strained the broth, added some roasted root, and carried the pot to the mechanics section himself. The damned man drank half a bowl from a spoon. On the 3rd spoonful, the whispering stopped. On the last one, he opened his eyes and asked why everyone was standing around him and why it smelled so much like soup. Then he fell asleep. He simply fell asleep the way people do. Dr. Yule, who had come to certify the death, stood over the sleeping man with an expression as if the law of gravity had been suspended right before his eyes. Yule was the train's chief skeptic. He'd been cutting and stitching for 20 years and believed in nothing but alcohol and thread. He took the leftover broth from Asher to test and left without saying goodbye. But the next morning he returned, silently placed a box of bandages on the counter, and said that the infirmary would refer to him whatever cases medicine couldn't handle. He said this this with hatred in his voice and respect in his eyes. The incident with the mechanic had broken the dam. The entire train headed to the diner, and that's when something Asher hadn't planned for came to light. Seated at one table with him were people who hadn't spoken to each other in the aisles for years. The mechanics were at odds with the greenhouse workers over water. The guards were at odds with the tail end of the train over past raids. The 19th hunters were at odds with everyone over prices. But the line leveled the playing field for everyone, and the hot meal softened even old feuds. Asher hung a board above the counter and wrote 3 rules on it in charcoal. In Car 34, you do not carry weapons in your hands. You do not settle debts. You do not continue arguments started outside. Whoever broke a rule would no longer be allowed to eat. The first rule was tested by a hunter who grabbed the man at the back of the line over a spot in the queue. Asher stepped out from behind the counter and said the hunter could either apologize or leave for good. The hunter looked at the bowl of steaming bone dog meat and apologized. The line buzzed with approval, and so Car 34 was first dubbed neutral ground. The term caught on in a single day, and on the evening of the 9th day, Craig's reply arrived. Asher discovered it when he turned on the main water valve, and the valve hissed with emptiness. The technician he called over averted his eyes and mumbled that a plug had been installed on the branch line of Car 34 by order of the distribution committee due to a pipe inspection. The distribution committee was in Craig's pocket. Without water, the kitchen was dying. Tea, soup, broth, and washing the pots. Everything depended on water. There was 1 day left until the car council meeting where Asher's fate would be decided. Craig had timed his move perfectly. Tomorrow the council would ask about the benefits, and the diner would face the day with a cold stove. Asher sat down behind the counter and stared at the faucet. Then Audra walked in with 2 guys. Each was carrying a small barrel on his shoulder. Audra said that the tail end had been living without a main water line for 6 years and collected condensation from the roofs and ice from the leaf springs at overnight stops. She said the water at the tail end was bad but plentiful, and he has a stove that boils water. Asher looked at the kegs and felt a sense of relief wash over him. Craig had cut him off. But Craig had always believed that the only things that bind people together are pipes and invoices. The car council was meeting in a former first-class car right behind the command car. Asher walked there with a sack slung over his shoulder and Pia serving as his escort, as required by regulations. 9 people sat at the long table. Senta from the guard, Ewell from the infirmary, the chief mechanic, the head of the greenhouses, Dolan Craig from the market rows, 4 more from the residential sections. The rank and file had no say in the council. The charges were read quickly. Theft of 3 boxes of squirrel meat. The storekeeper repeated his testimony, staring at the table. Then Senta asked about the use of Car 34, and Asher untied the sack. He didn't make any speeches. He placed 9 bowls and a pot on the council table and poured out white heron broth with roasted root. He said that words about food are cheaper than the food itself. The council ate in silence. Before the head of the greenhouse's eyes, the swelling in the sick joints of the fingers subsided. Ewell noted the effect aloud as a medic. Senta put down her spoon and asked the council if they had any questions about the benefits. There were no questions about the benefits. Craig had a question. He gently said that the benefits were undeniable, and that this was precisely why such a resource could not be left in the hands of a single person without supervision. He proposed transferring Car 34 to the control of the distribution committee and keeping the cook on the payroll as an employee, for the common good. Asher saw several council members nodding thoughtfully and realized that it was not the prosecution, but Craig's appetite that was losing the day. It wasn't his speech that saved him, but a piece of paper. Ewell raised his hand and said dryly that, according to the late Tobias's testimony, the seal of the hearth was bound to the keeper of the key, and without the keeper, it was merely an oven. He said he had looked into this matter 10 years ago when Tobias was treating Burns with food, and that the committee would receive the wagon, but not the miracle. Senta added that the guards personally verify the contract with the keeper. They voted openly. 6-3, they dropped the charges and assigned the wagon to Asher. Craig voted for him, and that was worse than if he'd voted against him. As he was leaving, Craig lingered nearby and quietly said that he respected people who knew how to count. Then he asked if Asher had calculated how much it cost to guard the neutral land that everyone loved but no one defended. The answer to that question came 2 stops later. The night had been bad from the moment the sun set. They came upon an old station with a long, dilapidated depot behind the platform. Monsters poured out in droves, and among the usual hunters and hounds, something large was moving through the ruins, causing the windows to rattle. The hunters didn't shoot so as not to provoke it. The train fell silent. At 3 in the morning, Asher was awakened by a crash in the vestibule. He leaped out with a knife and saw 2 masked men breaking down the door to his storage room. A third stood by the stove, pouring oil from a flask onto the cast iron grate. Arson at the overnight stop was a capital offense for the entire train crew, but that didn't bother the perpetrators. Asher lunged at the man by the stove. The fight was brief and brutal. Asher was struck in the ribs with a cane and flew onto the tables. The arsonist struck a flint, and then the stove opened its damper on its own. A white flame burst from the opening without touching the tables or walls. It licked the oil off the cast iron and rose between the arsonist and the stove as a smooth, humming wall. The arsonist screamed and rushed away, dropping the flask. The other 2 dragged him out into the vestibule, and all 3 vanished toward the front of the train. Asher lay on the floor amid the overturned tables and watched as the white flame calmly retreated back beneath the damper. The display above the stove glowed with a new line. The hearth protects itself. The hearth does not protect its keeper. Fortify what is mortal. His ribs ached so badly that his vision grew dark. Asher crawled over to the pot containing yesterday's stew, reheated it over the white flame, and ate through the pain until it subsided. In the morning, he didn't go to complain to the guards. There was no evidence, and Craig knew how to buy alibis in bulk. Instead, he went to see Garm. The senior hunter of the 19th car greeted him sullenly. The week-long ban on trade with the 34th car had cost the hunters 1/3 of their income, and they were angry at everyone at once. Asher laid out a plan on the table. He needed meat from a large creature from the depot, the very one that made the windows rattle. The order rated ingredients by the strength of their source, and after that night, Asher needed something stronger than soup. He needed food that would fortify what is mortal. Garm tapped his temple with a finger and said that a hammerhead lived in the depot, that a carbine wouldn't pierce the hammerhead's hide, and that the platform's demon wouldn't let the creature out, but wouldn't let the hunters in either. Asher said the hunters didn't need to go in. The hammerhead had to come to the barrier on its own. He asked what the creature was most drawn to. Garm replied that it was drawn to blood and fear. Asher said he had a third, scent. At the next stop, he set up a brazier in the open vestibule right by the boundary and roasted the meat of a bone hound on it, seasoned with fat and herbs. The wind blew from the train toward the ruins. The scent of hot meat wafted over the dead city, where for 6 years nothing had smelled of anything but dust. The Varus at the edge were the first to go mad. Then the depot creaked. The hammerhead stepped into the light of the watchfires, and he was half the size of a train car. A flat, bony head, legs like piles. It followed the scent without looking around, and Garm's hunters fired point blank from 6 barrels at the only soft spot under its jaw that Garm had spotted through the telescope. The creature fell with its head on the tracks. The tailmen and hunters worked together, hauling the carcass with hooks and a winch until dawn, while Asher roasted the meat for the workers right there on the spot. That night would long be remembered on the train as the night of the great feast. The mark took the form of a white flash on the hammerhead. The meat turned out to have 2 properties: stone-like resilience. For an hour, the eater's bones and muscles withstood the impact like wood, and deep satiety. A single meal sustained a person for 2 days. The second level of the table gave way to the third, but Asher's main discovery that night wasn't made on the stove. While butchering the carcass, Garm pulled a rusty object from the hammerhead's throat and was about to throw it away, but Asher took it for himself. It was an old-world railroad token with the station number and name stamped on it. Junction 8, Zarnitsa Depot. Asher cleaned the token and placed it on the counter next to Senta's staff map. He'd noticed something odd about the map before. The stops didn't repeat, but they formed a jagged line with a general direction. Now he took a piece of charcoal and marked the stations from the past few weeks on the map, based on the stories of the old-timers. Then he placed the token next to them. Junction 8 was marked on the old pre-war maps on the same side where the line of stops slowly and stubbornly curved. Asher sat poring over the map until morning. It turned out that the train hadn't been wandering. The train was moving. No one knew where the train was going except the engineers, and no one had ever seen the engineers. The door to the lead car hadn't opened in 6 years. He hid the map and the token under a floorboard near the stove, and a day later, a man Asher wasn't expecting walked into the diner. The head steward of the 7th car, a stout, taciturn man named Botvin, sat down at the counter, waited until the room was empty, and spoke quietly. He said that 30 years ago, he had worked as a dispatcher on the railroads of the old world. He said he had recognized the jagged line when Asher was asking the old-timers about the stops, because he himself had drawn such lines throughout his youth. He leaned in closer and said that all the stations where they had stopped lay on an old supply line, and that this line ended in a dead end. A single, solitary place. He fell silent, and Asher asked what kind of place it was. Botvin replied that at the end of the line stood a research facility where, a year before the disaster, they had been building a structure that the dispatchers had been ordered to forget about. He said that, according to rumors, that's where it all began, and that if the line isn't lying, the train is taking them straight there. Asher looked out the window at the vast wasteland rolling by. He remembered the white flame of the hearth, which was older than the train itself. He asked Botvin why he had told this to the cook instead of the council. Botvin was silent for a long time. Then he said that the council was Craig, and that Craig would sell even the end of the world if he found a buyer, and that the only person on this train you could trust was the one who fed people and asked for nothing in return. Asher decided to keep the secret of the route under the floorboards for now, along with the map. The train had enough wars to deal with, even without knowing it was heading toward the source of the catastrophe, and war was already knocking at the door. Craig realized that crushing the snack bar from the outside hadn't worked, so he changed tactics. He began putting pressure on the people. First, the greenhouse workers disappeared from the line. Botvin arrived in the evening looking gloomy and said that the distribution committee had raised his section's quota for turning in greens, and hinted that the quota would rise even further if the workers in the 7th car spent their earnings in the 34th. Then the committee cut the purchase price for bones in half for Garm's hunters. Then a rumor began to spread through the residential sections that the food from the communal kitchen was addictive, and that the low-ranking workers were throwing carrion into the cauldrons. The rumor was silly but persistent. The line at the door shortened by a third. Asher counted the takings and realized that Craig wasn't fighting him, but his guests, and that this war was won with patience and money, and Craig had more of both. Senta came in to pick up the contracted portions, looked at the rather empty dining room, and said she'd seen this happen during her first year. She said you can't keep a crowd with gratitude alone. A crowd is held together by either fear, habit, or a common cause. Asher asked what she was suggesting. Senta replied that she wasn't suggesting anything, just reminiscing aloud about her youth. And as she was already at the door, she added that a long layover was scheduled in 2 days. A night at an old junction station with a large terminal. The train didn't like stations like that. Large buildings meant large creatures. Asher thought for exactly 24 hours. Then he walked through the train on his own. He called out to everyone, the mechanics, the guards, the tail crew, the greenhouse workers, the hunters, and the living quarters. He said the same thing over and over. On the night of the long layover, Car 34 will set a communal table on the platform under the watch lights, free of charge. A bowl of hot food and a chunk of meat for everyone who comes. People looked at him as if he were mad. Eating on the platform at night, 20 paces from the line beyond which the beasts stand. Asher gave the same answer to everyone. The beasts haven't crossed that line in 6 years, and everyone can leave their fear behind in the car. Craig reacted instantly. An announcement was made through the intercom that the committee did not recommend participating in the dangerous gathering and that no assistance would be provided to those who got hurt. That was a mistake. The ban achieved what no advertisement ever could have. The entire train began talking about the table on the platform. During the long overnight stop, the train pulled up at the abandoned station with its collapsed roof. Asher and the rear car passengers hauled trestles, planks, and cauldrons onto the platform. He carried the white fire from the hearth in braziers, and the fire burned obediently outside the car as long as the guardian stood nearby. He hadn't known this himself before. The rear car passengers were the first to arrive, the entire train, because the rear was no longer afraid of anything. Then came the guards, led by Pia, then the mechanics, then the rest followed, and by midnight more than 200 people were sitting on the planks on the platform. The creatures stood behind the wall. Green eyes, white herons, and bony hounds gazed at the fires, the people, and the steam rising from the boilers. At first, the people sat with their backs to the train and their faces toward the creatures, holding their bowls as weapons. Then one of the mechanics laughed at a joke made by a tailcar passenger. Then an old woman from the living section struck up an old-world song, and others joined in. Asher stood by the braziers, serving food and watching as 200 people from 10 warring cars ate at a single table in the midst of a nighttime nightmare. And the nightmare receded, not from gunshots, but from the smell of roasted meat and the song. Yule approached with a bowl and grumbled that, as a medic, he was obliged to call this mass insanity. Then he added that for the first time in 6 years, he'd seen the people on the train with living faces. And then, the night shattered. Something rose silently from the gap in the station roof. It was as wide as a cloud, and as thin as smoke, and its eyes weren't paired but scattered across its body like a handful of dim stars. The creatures at the edge all fell to the ground at once. The song died. The creature floated over the ruins toward the platform, and in its shadow, the station lights turned gray. Garm shouted that it was the night shepherd, and that shooting was useless because its body was made of smoke. Someone knocked over a bench. The crowd surged toward the train car doors, and Asher realized that 200 people were about to crush each other in the vestibules. The shepherd reached the boundary and flowed right through it. The line that no creature had crossed in 6 years didn't stop him. A scream rose from the platform, and then two things happened at once. The first was Senta. She didn't run. She barked so loudly that she drowned out the screams, and the guards formed a chain between the crowd and the shepherd, simply so the crowd would see their backs rather than emptiness. The second thing was the hearth. The braziers with their white flames flared up to a man's height. The shepherd recoiled from the light like smoke from a draft. Asher grabbed the nearest brazier by the flame with his bare hands, feeling no heat, and advanced on the creature. He walked forward, and the white fire hummed before him, while the shepherd's smoky body tore apart and melted wherever the light touched it. Scattered eyes all stared at Asher at once, and a single phrase flashed through his mind, not as a voice, but as a chill. The keeper of the fire is going home. Then the shepherd curled up into a bundle and vanished upward into the darkness, and the creatures beyond the boundary rose and scattered as if nothing had happened. The silence on the platform was so thick you could hear the white fire crackling. Then 200 people exhaled all at once. No one had died. No one had even been grazed. People returned to the tables on shaky legs and sat down. Someone laughed nervously, and Odra said loudly that after something like that, it would be a sin not to finish their meals. And they finished their meals, every last bit from the pots. The next morning, the train hummed along. The story of that night grew with every retelling. By noon, word had spread that the cook from car 34 had driven away Death himself with white fire, and that neutral ground was the only place that was protected, even where the devil himself couldn't reach. The line at the door grew twice as long as before, and now even the foremen from Craig's own market stalls were standing in it. Rumors of carry-on and addiction died out in a single morning, and that evening, Craig himself came to the diner, alone, without porters. He sat down at the counter, ordered tea, and paid with a bullet, just like everyone else. He said he knew how to lose a round, and that he was removing the plug from the water line and lifting the bands, because fighting a man whom the train considers a saint is bad business. Asher remained silent and waited. Craig took a sip of tea and continued in the same soft voice. He said that that since it was useless to keep pressing the issue, he was proposing an alliance. He said that what he'd seen that night wasn't a miracle, but a resource. The fire that stops the creatures is worth more than his entire trading house. Then he leaned in and added very quietly that he knew something. He said that before he died, old man Tobias had owed him 40 rounds of ammunition, and to settle the debt, he told him something interesting, that the hearth wasn't just a stove, that the hearth had been removed from another train, from the first train, the very one that had left for the research hub on the day of the disaster and never returned. Craig finished his tea, stood up, and, already at the door, said that when Asher wanted to know the rest, the price would be fair, a partnership and a half. The door closed. Asher stood behind the counter and watched the quiet white flame beneath the damper. The shepherd's words grew cold in his memory. The keeper of the fire was heading home. He lifted a floorboard, pulled out a map, and placed the Zarnitsa depot token next to it. The jagged line of stops ended at a dead end on the main line. The hearth had been removed from the train that had vanished into that dead end. And now the hearth was returning there, and it was carrying 77 cars full of living people. Asher neither accepted nor rejected Craig's offer. He said he'd think about it, and that was true. There was plenty to think about. Craig knew more about the first train than he was letting on, and the only way to find that out was either by becoming his partner or by finding another source. Asher had another source, Botvin. The former dispatcher showed up the following evening on his own, uninvited. Asher bolted the door, set out some tea and baked root on the counter, and relayed Craig's words about the first train to him. Botvin listened, and his face seemed to age before his eyes. Then he spoke. He said that the first train was called the Zarnitsa lettered train, named after the depots where it was registered. That a year before the disaster, the junction had been closed to civilian traffic, but the lettered train had been transporting equipment and people in uniforms without insignia there. The dispatchers were ordered to route it outside the schedule and not to record it in the logs. Botvin had routed it 11 times. On the day of the disaster, the lettered train passed his post toward the junction at 4 in the morning. At 6, the sky in the east turned white, then crimson, and has remained crimson ever since. Asher asked how a container bearing the seal could have ended up on the lettered train. Botvin spread his hands. He said that in his day, miracles didn't happen on the railroad. But he added one detail. On the lettered train's last run, among the platforms carrying containers, there was a single old-style passenger car, wooden. They'd been taken out of service back in his father's day. He remembered it because a wooden car in a secret train looked like a mockery. Asher recalled his car, number 34, a steel body, but the interior paneling on the walls behind the counter was made of wood, darkened by time, and Tobias said the stove was older than the train itself. It turned out that after the disaster, someone had found the missing lettered train, or part of it, and dragged the stove, and possibly the car itself, into the current train. Only the engineers knew who did it and why. The door to the lead car hadn't opened for 6 years. No one brought the train drivers any food. No one knew if they were even alive, but the train kept running, stopping, and running again. Botvin left after midnight, making Asher promise to keep their conversation to himself. But in the morning, it turned out it was too late to keep his word. Senta came into the diner, and from the doorway, asked what kind of map he was hiding under the floorboard by the stove. Asher froze. Senta sat down at the counter and explained calmly. That night, her post had seen Craig's sales clerk loitering by the vestibule of car number 34 with a listening tube. The clerk's guard escorted him home with a stern warning. But she said that the walls on the train were thin and that Craig paid better for other people's conversations than he did for merchandise, and she repeated the question about the map. Asher made up his mind in a single breath. The guards were the only force Craig couldn't buy in bulk, and Senta was the only person on the council who had never once lied to him, not even about the smallest thing. He lifted the floorboard and laid everything out before her. The map with the broken line, a token from the Zarnitsa depot, Botvin's account of the letter formation, the shepherd's words about the guardian heading home. Senta studied the map for a long time. Then she said something that made Asher's shoulders tense up. She said that the guard had known the route for 2 years already. She had drawn up the staff maps herself and had seen the line long ago. She said she had reported to the former head of the council, but a week later, the former head had been poisoned by mushrooms from his own supplies, and since then she had been reporting only to her own reflection. Asher asked why the train had never once tried to change its route. Senta smiled without joy. She said they had tried in the 3rd year. The engineers didn't respond to the knocking. Then a group of mechanics at the station manually switched the point ahead of the train. The train passed the point, and the point snapped back into place on its own. At the next station, all 4 of those mechanics failed to return from the platform, even though they'd been standing just a few steps away from the car. After that, no one was left who wanted to argue with the train. She folded up the map and stated the most important point. According to her calculations, there were between 40 and 60 stops left to the dead end of the main line. 2 months, maybe 3. The train would reach its destination before the crew realized where it was going and what to do about it. Panic would set in when people saw the familiar pre-war station names near the junction. They needed to gather those capable of thinking before the panic began. She called it a quiet council. She said the quiet council would consist of herself, Asher, Yule, Botvin, Odra, and Garm. Not a single person from the merchant ranks. Asher asked why she was including him, a cook on the war council. Senta looked at him as if he were a slow-witted recruit. She said that the shepherd hadn't stopped in front of the guards. The first meeting of the Quiet Council took place 2 nights later in a diner after closing time, with the lamps extinguished. 6 people huddled over a map. Yule listened to everything and said that, as a medic, he was obliged to ask the obvious. If the train couldn't be stopped or turned around, what exactly were they planning to do? A silence hung in the air. Odra replied. She said that the tale had been living on a train for 6 years, a train that could neither be stopped nor turned around, and was doing the only thing possible, preparing for each coming night. She said that if, at the end of the journey, a place awaited them where all the creatures were born, they must prepare as if for the longest night of all. Food that heals and strengthens. Weapons that take down the creatures. People who don't tear each other's throats out. Garm added more details about the weapons. Ordinary bullets only took down small creatures. They had to shoot the hammerhead point blank at a single spot. Against the shepherd, gun barrels were completely useless. Only white fire worked. He asked Asher if the hearth provided fire not only in the brazier. Asher didn't know. That night after the council, he stayed alone by the stove and spoke aloud to the hearth for the first time. He felt like a fool. He asked if he could take the white fire with him beyond the platform. The tablet remained silent. Then he changed his question. He asked how to strengthen that which is mortal, and the lines appeared. The keeper grows with the hearth. The hearth grows with the keeper. Feed many, feed them well. The flame follows the one who feeds. A status line flashed below. Keeper level 3. To reach level 4, he still needed to feed 412 eaters. Asher sat down on the floor by the warm cast iron stove and laughed quietly, almost happily. The hearth spoke to him in the only language the cook understood without translation. You want power. Feed the people. At dawn, he drew up a plan, which he presented to the Quiet Council that evening. The snack bar was ceasing to be a shop and becoming the train's kitchen. Asher was taking on apprentices to cook more. The tail was increasing its hall of creatures. Under the guise of the council's new regulations, Botvin's greenhouses converted 2 garden beds to grow herbs for the kitchen. The guards received enhanced rations with potions instead of their standard pay. Yule officially delivered food from the hearth to the infirmary, and during every long stop, a communal table on the platform brought the crew together, because the flame follows whoever feeds, and there were many to feed. The council adjourned after dark. Asher was extinguishing the lamps when there was a scratch at the door. Standing on the threshold was Pia, both flustered and determined at the same time. She blurted out that she'd overheard something she shouldn't have while on guard duty, and that if a long night was coming, she wanted to ask to become his apprentice. She said that many people know how to shoot, but she wants to learn what stops the shepherds. Asher looked at her sunburned cheek and her stubborn eyes and said that an apprentice gets up 2 hours before opening. Pia beamed and asked when it opened. Asher replied that it was in 2 hours. The apprentices transformed the kitchen faster than Asher had expected. Pia turned out to be diligent, but stiff. She cut slowly. She salted by the ruler. But she could do something Asher himself couldn't. She knew how to follow a schedule and take notes. Within a week, she had a notebook where every recipe from the hearth was broken down into steps and grams. Asher cooked by instinct and couldn't explain that instinct, but Pia's notebook could. The second student was a boy from the back of the line named Kel, the very one who'd gotten a scrape on his hand while leaning over a bowl. Audra brought him in herself and said that the boy had been stealing food since he was 8, which meant he understood it better than most. Kel handled a knife as if it were an extension of his arm, but he didn't know when to stop. He oversalted, overpeppered, and overcooked. He cooked the way he fought. Asher put him in charge of butchering carcasses and prepping ingredients, and that's when the boy really came into his own. Asher didn't take on a third apprentice. The third one came on his own. That evening, a skinny man with a bandaged hand sat down at the counter and said he'd been a cook in Craig's market stalls until he scalded his hand and became useless. His name was Marin. Asher hesitated for 2 days. A man from Craig's in the kitchen was either a spy or a godsend. A trial run would decide. Asher had Marin cook a simple porridge on a regular burner without the seal. Marin cooked the porridge so well that the people in line were drooling just from the smell. They don't teach that in spy school. Asher took him on the condition that Marin wouldn't be allowed near the seal or the table. The kitchen came to life with 4 pairs of hands. The eater counter spun like a wheel on a slope. 180 eaters a day. 210.
240. 11 days later, the table glowed white, and Asher read the 4th level lines. The simmering recipe has been unlocked. The slow heat of the hearth doubles the properties of the ingredients. The communal cauldron function has been unlocked. A single dish serving 40 or more diners gains the property of shared resilience. Damage taken by one diner is divided among everyone who ate from the cauldron that day. Asher reread the last line 5 times and called for Senta in the middle of the night. Senta read it and sat down. She said that this changed the entire strategy for the long night. A squad that has eaten from the communal cauldron cannot be wiped out by killing just one member. A wound inflicted on one will be spread across 40, and each will feel only a scratch. She demanded a test. The test was carried out at the next campsite, quietly and brutally, as only the guard could manage. 40 guards ate stewed hammerhead from the communal pot. Then, in front of everyone, Senta slashed her forearm with a knife. The cut was deep. The bleeding stopped almost immediately, and the 40 people around her hissed in unison and grabbed their forearms, where thin white scratches had appeared. Within a minute, not even the scratches remained. The shared resilience was working. When Garm found out, he paced around the diner, cursing with delight. He said that with a cauldron like that, they could cross the line. The words hung in the air. No one had ever crossed the line of their own free will, but the quiet council was already thinking the same thing. Preparing for a long night meant eventually learning to fight on the creature's turf, not just from beyond the boundary. They planned their first sortie for a long stop at the old grain silo. They set a modest goal, 20 steps beyond the boundary, retrieve the carcass of a heron they'd shot beforehand, and return. 10 of them set out. Garm with 3 hunters, Pia with 3 guards, 2 rear guards with hooks. All 10 ate from the communal cauldron of double-strength, slow-simmered hammerhead stew. Asher stood at the boundary with a brazier of white fire as a last resort. That night, the creatures held their ground in the distant ruins. The 10 crossed the line, and the wasteland took them in. Asher watched as the 10 glimmers of their chest lamps faded into the darkness, and his legs gave way. On the 15th step, a bone-white hound burst from beneath the ground. It seized the nearest hunter by the thigh before the guns could fire. The hunter fell, but he fell laughing. The bite split among the 10, and each felt a prick instead of a gaping wound. They finished off the hound at point-blank range. The herons dragged the carcass back at a run. When the squad crossed the line back onto the platform, it erupted in a shout that contained less fear than triumph. The men beyond the line had fought the creature and returned unscathed. All of them. For the first time in 6 years, Yule examined the bitten man and recorded in writing that the wound from the bone dog's fangs had healed in 4 minutes. He filed the sheet in the infirmary log and told Asher that this log would someday be read as a chronicle if there was anyone left to read it. The sorties became a routine. During every long stop, a squad would venture beyond the boundary. 20 paces turned into 50, then into 100. The hall was unlike anything the train had ever seen. The carcasses of creatures previously known only by their silhouettes, the sea
seal devoured new species, and the charts swelled with their characteristics. The meat of the creeping lantern-bearer glowed in the stomach, and for an hour allowed one to see the warmth of the living through the walls. The fat of the deep-dwelling mole masked the smell of humans for a day, and the creatures lost sight of their predator. The bone marrow of the horned silent one granted an hour of complete silence to one's footsteps. Asher's kitchen was turning into an arsenal, and the entire quiet council sensed a forgotten substance rising from the bottom of the train: hope. And then everyone wanted to cross the line. A line had formed outside the diner since morning, not for food. Young mechanics were begging to join the top 10. The guys from the rear were whining at Garm. Even two of Craig's clerks showed up with their own carbines. The quiet council argued until they were hoarse. Garm demanded a second squad. Senta objected that the crowd beyond the line meant a guaranteed funeral, and that the shared pool of health points would distribute the damage but wouldn't prevent death if the damage was severe. While they were arguing, trouble struck from a direction they hadn't expected. On a sortie near the water tower, the second squad, hastily assembled by Garm from volunteers, advanced 120 paces, got carried away by easy prey, and plunged into darkness at the call of the lamplighter, who knew how to mimic others' voices. They came to their senses when the platform's warning lights had shrunk to a dot. They were overrun by a pack of hunters. The communal cauldron spread the bites across the 10 of them, but there were 40 bites a minute. All 10 made it to the line. All 10 lay down beyond the line. Alive but gray with pain, Ewell and his assistants pumped them out until dawn, while the train watched and drew its conclusions. In the morning, Asher convened a council and said that he was to blame because he had granted power before the rules were established. He hung a second board above the counter: the rules of the line. Only the 10 who had passed Senta and Garm's selection may cross the line. No one goes more than 100 steps beyond it. No one answers a voice from the darkness. Whoever violates this rule is no longer part of the top 10. Ever. The train accepted the rules. By that time, the train accepted almost everything from Asher, and only one man among them watched the lines forming at the 34th car, assessing not the non-eaters, but the balance of power. Dolan Craig stopped showing up at the diner. His henchmen paid for their rounds like everyone else and kept quiet. His warehouses traded as usual. He didn't pressure, threaten, or make offers. He waited. And Asher, with the gut instinct of a cook who knows when the pot is about to boil, sensed that this silence was simmering on the stove. The answer came at the end of the month through Morena. The scalded cook lingered after his shift, wiping down the counter with a rag longer than necessary, and finally said in a muffled voice that he had to confess. Craig had put his family on the debt list. Marin's wife sewed for the market stalls and owed as much for needles and thread as half a trainload. Yesterday, the foreman told Marin that the debt would be forgiven if he revealed how the cook made the fiery food and what was written on the wall above the stove. Asher asked what Marin had replied. Marin set down the rag and said he'd told the truth, that they wouldn't let him near the seal, and he knew nothing. He'd come to tell his story because for the first time in 6 years, he'd eaten his fill in this kitchen over the past month, and because no one here had ever called him a cripple. Asher poured him some tea, and they sat in silence. Then Asher said that the diner would pay off his family's debt tomorrow, deducting it from his wages, and that Marin could tell Craig exactly one thing. The cook was ready to meet and talk about the first train. It was time to find out how much the merchant actually knew. According to Senta's calculations, there were about 30 stops left to the dead end of the main line. Craig scheduled the meeting on his own property, in the trading row office behind the warehouse. Asher went alone. Senta suggested stationing a guard at the door, but Asher refused. A conversation about secrets isn't a conversation if there's a guard present. The office turned out to be a cramped room that smelled of dried fish and ink. Craig was sitting at a table on which lay a single item, a thick notebook with an oilcloth cover. He began without preamble. He said he would tell everything he knew for free. He would name a price later for whatever Asher chose to buy. He opened the notebook. The notebook did not belong to him, but to a man named Severin Polk, the supply chief for the Zarnitsa letter class unit. In his 3rd year, Craig had traded for it from a looter at the southern parking lot in exchange for a crate of canned goods. The looter had taken it from a dead man in a uniform without insignia, 5 kilometers from the tracks. Craig read aloud. The supply officer's notes were as dry as shipping documents, and all the more terrifying for it. The train carried components to the hub for a system referred to in the notebook simply as the door. The installation was being built in the underground level of the Zarnitsa depot. The purpose wasn't explained in the notebook, but Polk had twice recorded the engineer's complaint that the door drew energy not from the grid but from the people near it, and that work shifts near the unit had been reduced to 1 hour. Asher listened, keeping a straight face. Craig flipped through the pages. The last entry was made on the morning of the disaster. Polk wrote that the nighttime activation had gone awry, that the door had opened wider than expected and had not closed, that something was coming from the other side, something for which he had no words, and that the commandant had ordered the personnel to leave immediately and remove the lock assembly. Next were 2 words that Polk had pressed so hard into the paper that he tore it. They didn't have time. Craig closed the notebook. He said that the looter who sold the notebook swore that the dead man was lying with his head toward the tracks and was holding an empty army trunk in his hands, with a recess for something round. The socket was lined with cloth, and a mark remained on the cloth, an imprint of an object the size of a large frying pan, with a pattern resembling a tongue of flame. A heavy silence hung in the office. Asher asked why Craig was telling him this. Craig folded his hands on the notebook, and for the first time ever spoke without his usual gentleness, simply and wearily. He said he was a merchant, not a fool. Trade exists as long as there are living customers. He had read the notebook 100 times, and had long since realized that the train was not an ark of salvation, but a mail horse. Someone or something has been gathering survivors across the dead world for 6 years, and taking them to where the door is open. And the only thing in the entire train that's connected to the lock on that door is standing in car 34, baking flatbread. He said his price was simple, a place by the hearth when the end begins, for him and his people. Not half the deal. Just a spot in the car that will survive the long night. Asher looked at the man who had signed his death warrant without batting an eye, and who was now buying his life in the only honest way he knew. He said that a place by the hearth isn't for sale or for purchase. It's earned. Craig's people would eat from the communal pot, work in the train kitchen, and stand in the general line, and then the hearth would count them as its own, just as it counts everyone else. Asher took the notebook for the quiet council. Craig gave a crooked smile and slid the notebook across the table. He said he'd always suspected that the strongest currency was a bowl of soup. The quiet council listened to the retelling of the notebook's contents in dead silence. Then they all spoke at once. Ewell demanded to know what the lock block meant, and why the hearth fed them if it was just a machine part. Botvin speculated aloud that if the door drew energy from people, then a train full of living beings wasn't carrying passengers, but fuel being transported to the facility. Odra asked the simplest question: could the hearth be removed from the train and drowned in a swamp? Asher replied that the hearth wouldn't give itself up, and reminded them of the white flame and the arrow that had returned on its own. Senta raised her hand, and everyone fell silent. She said that panic in the council was the same panic, only behind a closed door. They had 3 facts. The train was heading toward the door. The hearth was connected to the castle. The hearth was on their side because it had been healing, feeding, and protecting them for 6 years. So the plan wasn't changing. It was getting stricter. Feed, strengthen, learn to fight beyond the line, and prepare the train for the truth before the truth arrives on its own. They decided to reveal the truth in parts. First to the section leaders, under oath. Then at the communal tables in simple terms. The train is heading toward a dangerous place. 20 stops from now will be the longest night. The kitchen and the guards are preparing everyone. Anyone who wants to help will find work. Asher was afraid the train would break under the weight of such truth. The train surprised him. People listened, grew somber, and asked the same thing over and over. What should we do? For 6 years, fear had neither a name nor a deadline, and it gnawed at everyone from within. Now fear had an address and a schedule, and they'd been given a shovel to fight it. The train sighed, and set to work. The kitchen switched to running 2 boilers around the clock. Botvin set aside 4 garden beds for herbs. The mechanics forged shields and spearheads from the bones of creatures in train car metal, following Garm's blueprints. The tale brought back 3 carcasses per sortie to the camp. Ewell ran drills throughout the sections on carrying the wounded. Even Craig's foreman joined the general line for kitchen unloading, and Marin commanded them with such a stern expression that Pia hid in the pantry to stifle her laughter. On the 5th level of the keeper, who arrived after 2 weeks of this life, the table revealed to Asher what he had been waiting for most of all: the recipe for a campfire. Coal taken from the hearth by the keeper maintains a white flame outside the car for 1 night, provided the carrier has eaten the seal's food. They tested it on a nearby sortie. Pia carried an iron lamp with coal, and when a trio of trackers emerged from the darkness about 10 paces away, she opened the damper. A white light flashed 20 paces away, and the hunters vanished into the ground right where they stood. Pia returned from the sortie and silently embraced Asher, smudging him with soot, and no one in the squad said a word because they all understood. For the first time, humans had a weapon against darkness itself, and not just against its fangs. And after 3 stops, the train pulled up at a station with a surviving sign, and a wave of excitement swept through the train from front to back. Botvin came into the diner, as white as flour, and placed a scrap of paper in front of Asher on which he had copied the letters from the sign. The station was called Leshchevka. Botvin said that from Leshchevka to the junction along the Old Ma main line, 12 stops, 12 nights. A quiet meeting was convened that very hour. Senta spread out the map one last time and said that the time for trial runs was over. In 12 nights, the train would arrive at the Zarnitsa depot. She looked at Asher and asked, in front of everyone, if the kitchen was ready for the longest night. Asher thought about the 2 cauldrons, the 300 trained mouths, the white coal lamps, and the apprentices who were already cooking just as well as he was. Then he thought of the door that draws power from the living, the one they hadn't managed to close. He answered honestly, the kitchen was ready to feed. As for whether he himself was ready to find out why the hearth had spent 6 years raising a guardian for itself, he didn't know. Oda snorted and said they'd all find out together. 12 nights was just enough time to finish cooking the strongest thing they had. The 12 nights turned into a countdown ticking away in every car. The mechanics marked the intervals with notches on the workshop wall. Ewell recounted the bandages. The kitchen was cooking so hard that the apprentices took turns sleeping on sacks in the storeroom, and the wasteland outside the windows began to change. On the 11th night from the end, the creatures from the edge didn't approach the platform for the first time. They stood at a distance in an uneven circle, looking not at the train, but eastward along the tracks. On the 10th night, new silhouettes appeared among the usual ones, tall figures made of smoke and bones that did not touch either people or creatures, but simply walked eastward through the ruins like pilgrims. Garm brought back something strange from his reconnaissance mission. The squad had found fresh tracks of a hammerhead that also led east and never veered toward water or prey. Botvin put into words what everyone was feeling. Their convoy isn't the only one heading for the door. Everything is converging there. On the 9th night, Asher had the conversation he'd been both waiting for and dreading. After closing time, Senta came into the diner without her insignia, wearing a plain jacket, and sat not at the bar, but at a table in the back like an ordinary guest. She said she wanted to ask him a question, not as a captain, but as a person. She asked what he would do if it turned out that the hearth was carrying them all as fuel for the door. If the lock isn't what locks things away, but what feeds them. Asher wiped his hands, sat down across from her, and told her what he hadn't told anyone else. For the past few nights, he'd been having the same dream. The kitchen of the old world, where he'd worked before the catastrophe. A late-night diner near the freight station. In the dream, he's cooking on his old stove, and creatures are sitting at the counter. Agile herons, a shepherd with eyes like scattered gems. They sit quietly like tired workers after their shift, and they're waiting for food. But he isn't afraid. afraid. He's angry that he can't keep up with everyone. Senta listened and was silent for a long time. Then she said she didn't know how to interpret dreams, but she judged people by their actions. For 6 years, the hearth had done only one thing: transformed others' power into shared food, creatures into stew, fear into a line, enmity into a shared table. If this is a machine, then this machine works the opposite way from the door. That one draws from the living. This one gives back to the living. She stood up, placed a coin on the table for the tea she hadn't drunk, and said, already at the door, that if at the end of the road there was a choice about who would stand at the lock, she had already cast her vote. The 8th night brought the 6th level of the Keeper. The table revealed its final row of entries, and Asher read them together with Pia, Kel, and Marin, because he decided there were no more secrets in the kitchen. The main recipe was revealed: the Hearth Feast, a single dish for the entire group, prepared by the Keeper and the apprentices on all the burners at once. Effect: all the properties of all the ingredients are shared among all diners for one night. Restriction: the feast can be prepared only once. After the feast, the seal will enter a standby state until it is restored. Marin whistled and asked what a standby state was. Asher didn't know. The table didn't answer. One thing was clear: their main trump card was a one-time use, and they had to use it on the longest night and not a moment sooner. Pia opened her notebook and began counting aloud. For a feast for 2,000 people, you need 4 hammerhead carcasses, a dozen herons, 3 dozen hunters and hounds, mole fat, silent one's brains, lantern bearers, salt, flour, herbs, and water in quantities that made Kel's face go pale. The gathering was scheduled for the remaining stops, and then, for the first time in 6 years, the train broke its own schedule. On the 7th night from the end, the train didn't stop. The platform glided past the windows with their emergency lights turned off and receded into the distance, but the train kept going until morning, and the entire train stood idle all night by the windows in silence. Botvan said aloud what everyone understood. The train was in a hurry. On the 6th night there was a stop, but it was brief. The creatures didn't come out at all. The wasteland stood empty, and that was worse than the green eyes. Garm's 10 took a risk and captured 2 hammerheads beyond the border by the dried-up river. The creatures offered almost no resistance. They were heading east and fought reluctantly, like people who'd been torn away from an important road. On the 5th night, there was neither a stop nor a station. The train plowed through the darkness, and outside the windows, along the tracks they marched. Columns of creatures of all kinds mixed together. The stream flowed eastward, parallel to the tracks, and no one in the cars was sleeping. In the morning, Yule, for the first time in years, dispensed a soothing decoction not to the sick, but to the healthy. The kitchen worked non-stop because the line for hot food had become for the train what the song on the platform had been: proof that life goes on. On the 4th night, something happened that the Quiet Council later called a census. The train came to a stop in the middle of a barren field with no station. At exactly midnight, something invisible passed along the length of the train from front to back. It didn't open any doors. It was simply that, in each car, people took turns feeling as if they were being weighed in the palm of a hand. Asher was standing by the stove when the wave reached the 34th car. The stove met it head-on. A white flame shot up from all the burners at once, and the wave washed over the car's side like water flows around a rock. In the neighboring cars, people shook and crossed themselves however best they could, but by morning, everyone was alive and unharmed. Everyone except one. For the first time in 6 years, a man stepped out of the train's lead car. The mechanics found him at dawn. He was sitting on the platform of the command car in a tattered engineer's uniform and had been dead for a long time. Dead for years. Dried out like a mummy. And on his lap lay a brass plaque with an engraving that Senta had brought to Asher, trusting no one else with it. The plaque read, Czar, Shift 2, Engineer Aidan Holt. The train that had carried them for 6 years had been driven by the dead. Or not the dead, but what remained when the door had taken its toll. The Quiet Council convened that afternoon, and Senta reported the rest. The mechanics had cut open the vestibule of the lead car behind the dead man. Behind the vestibule was a second door made of metal that neither welding nor acid could penetrate. Something was working behind the door, steady and quiet, like a great heart. Odra asked if they would break it open. Senta replied that they wouldn't. It was 3 nights to the junction. Only an enemy of itself would break the train's heart while it was still running. They made a different decision. All efforts would go toward preparing the feast. They would finish gathering supplies in 2 nights. The 3rd night would be set aside for cooking, because according to Pia's calculations, the feast took 10 hours to cook. For the last 2 nights, the train lived as a single organism. The rear crew and hunters collected the carcasses. The mechanics hauled them away. The greenhouse workers cleared the beds down to the ground. The guards maintained order in the lines for butchering. The apprentices didn't leave the kitchen, and Asher slept only 4 hours over 2 days, woken not by an alarm clock, but by the smell. By evening on the night before the final night, the storage car of the 34th and the 2 adjacent technical cars were packed to the ceiling. Everything was ready, and then the train began to slow down ahead of schedule. Botvin's burst into the kitchen with his old map and shouted from the doorway that this wasn't the junction yet, that there was still a whole stretch of track to the junction. The train crept along more and more slowly and finally came to a stop. Asher stepped out into the vestibule. Ahead, in the crimson twilight, lay a station that wasn't on Botvin's map. Fresh posts, a platform made of recently laid railroad ties, and bonfires were burning on the platform. Ordinary, reddish human bonfires. And standing between the bonfires were people, living people, not from the train. Dozens of people. They stood in silence, watching the train, and even from a distance, Asher could make out the insignia on their clothing, the tongue of flame, the very same symbol found on his key and on the hearth damper. A tall old man with a staff stepped away from the bonfires, approached the edge of the platform, and shouted a single phrase toward the train. He asked if the keeper of the fire was still alive, and if his table was ready. Asher stepped up to the platform edge himself. Behind him stood Senta with a dozen guards, and Garm with the hunters, but they all kept their weapons pointed downward. The old man waited at the edge, leaning on his staff. Up close, it was clear that the staff was a melted piece of railroad track, and the patch with the flame was embroidered onto his jacket with rough stitches, but exactly according to the design of the brand. Asher said that he was the keeper of the fire for Car 34. The old man looked at him for a long time with teary eyes. Then he turned toward the bonfires and shouted to his people that the fire had reached them, and the platform exhaled, as if several dozen people had simultaneously released a breath they'd been holding for years. The old man's name was Ivo Rat. We spent the night at that station, and that night was spent listening to a story that turned everything the Quiet Council knew about the world upside down. Ivo's people were the descendants and remnants of the hub's staff, those who, on the day of the disaster, had been on external duty at the Zarnitsa depot and had avoided the initial release. 42 people now. There had been 400. For 6 years, they had lived in a fortified settlement away from the hub because it was impossible to approach the hub itself. The hub was burning, not with fire. Ivo called it the Gaunt Light, a glow above the depot that ground everything alive into beasts if it came within 3 kilometers. All the beasts of the wasteland, according to Ivo, had once been people and beasts of the old world, who had been engulfed by the emissions from the door. Asher remembered the heron and its almost human way of bowing its head, and he felt queasy. Ivo knew more about the door than the supply clerk's notebook did. He had been the on-duty electrician for the outer circuit that night. The door was not built as a weapon or an experiment. It was built as a barrier. A year before the catastrophe, deep-sea seismic stations began detecting a rhythm beneath the continent, slow and lifeless, like a knock on a door from the inside. Something was awakening beneath the crust, and the government of the old world was secretly constructing a device at the junction that was meant to seal off the awakening channel before it opened on its own. They didn't manage to finish the lock in time. The channel burst open on the night of the tests, and a faint light poured in from the other side. The crew carrying the second half of the lock left the node an hour before the eruption and vanished. Ivo said that for 6 years they had been waiting not for a miracle, but for exactly this, because they knew the most important thing from a dying engineer. The lock is assembled from 2 halves. The first half remained at the hub in
a protected level beneath the depot. The second half was mounted in a test carrier, an ordinary kitchen stove in a wooden car of the lettered train. The engineers laughed at this solution, but the carrier required a constant supply of living heat, and nothing in the world produces as much living heat as a kitchen that feeds people. The gratitude of those eating warmed the lock better than any reactor. Marin, whom Asher had taken along as the train's most reliable ears, whispered that now it was clear why the hearth had ordered them to feed many people well. Ivo continued. The train, assembled from one of the surviving trains, had been traveling along the dead rail lines for 6 years, and they had seen it 3 times from a distance, but could not catch up to it. They realized that the train was circling the Earth, gathering survivors and warming the second half of the castle, and that one day it would turn toward the junction because that was how the Laterni's route had been programmed: deliver the castle at any cost. The dead crew of engineers carried out the commandant's final order. Senta asked the most important question:
What will happen when the lock is assembled? Ivo replied quietly that the lock must not simply be brought, but inserted and turned. Only a living hand, to which the carrier has become bound, can fit the second half into the first, the keeper. And the lock is turned not by force, but by the very thing that warmed it: heat. The combined, shared heat of all who are willing to give. The engineer called this a calculated sacrifice, and died before he could explain how much heat the lock would require. Maybe it was fatigue, maybe it was the years of his life, maybe it was everything. A silence hung over the platform, punctuated by the crackling of bonfires. Asher stood there, feeling eyes upon him, the guards of the human hunters, Ivo and his students. He asked Ivo how far it was from the end of the tracks to the level containing the first half. Ivo replied that the tracks ended a kilometer from the depot. From there, it was on foot through the zone of dim light, where people turn into beasts within an hour, unless something stronger than the light holds them back. Asher turned to his companions and said matter-of-factly that this was exactly what they'd been preparing for: the longest night with a walk. They held a meeting with Ivo's people right there by the campfires. The plan took shape before dawn, and it was simple and terrifying. The train would reach the end of the tracks by sunset the following day. At sunset, the kitchen would serve the feast of the hearth to the entire train crew and all of Ivo's people. One night of shared resilience. The rock-solid steadfastness of a 2,000-strong mob. The shared resilience of a common cauldron, divided among them all at once. Twilight vision. The silence of footsteps. The suppression of scent. The train crew takes up defensive positions around the last platform and holds the line through the night, because the creatures will all converge on the junction. Meanwhile, a small detachment with Asher and the hearth walks a kilometer in the dim light toward the depot and down into the level. Garm asked how they would carry the hearth. Ivo smiled for the first time that night and said that the bearer had waited 6 years for this and would carry it himself. All they had to do was open the hatch for him and call out. They argued about only one thing: who would go with the keeper. Everyone volunteered, and Senta cut the list without mercy. Hundreds would have gone, but according to Ivo, the dim light would only allow those who were closely shielded by the carrier. No more than 10 people. On the final list, Senta added herself, Garma, Piu, and Odra, the 2 best hunters, 2 guards, Ivo as the guide, and after a long pause, Asher himself added Marin, because if the castle needed the warmth of the cooks, there had to be 2 of them. Kel wept that he wasn't being chosen, and Asher appointed him head chef of the defense kitchen, and the boy fell silent, overwhelmed by the trust placed in him. The morning before departure, another conversation took place. Asher found Craig at his warehouse, where foremen were loading shields for the defensive line. He told the merchant about the planned sacrifice honestly, because the merchant had bought a place by the hearth not for such an end. Craig listened in silence. Then he said something strange. He said that he'd been taking a cut his whole life, and this was the first time he'd seen a deal where the cut was being taken from him, and that there was a fairness to it that he didn't want to haggle over. He took the key to the main warehouse off his neck and handed it to Asher for the final preparations without keeping track. The train set off around noon. Eva's people rode at the rear, looking out the windows at the wasteland they had walked through their entire lives. The wasteland beyond the windows thickened with creatures. Columns of them converged on the main line and marched alongside the train without attacking, and there was such dread in this accompanying procession that the windows were curtained shut. By sunset, a glow appeared ahead. Not crimson as usual, but a pale, lifeless radiance across the entire sky, the faint light of the junction. The train began to slow down for the last time. Asher stood in the kitchen among the students. All the burners were glowing white. 4 hammerhead carcasses were simmering, cut into pieces, in the largest pots. The feast would take 10 hours, and 9 had already passed on the road. The panel above the stove glowed with a single line that Asher had never seen before. The hearth is ready. Is the keeper ready? The train came to a stop. The tracks had ended. Outside the window, bathed in a pale glow, lay the world's last platform, and a kilometer beyond it loomed the Zarnitsa depot, over which a dead glow stood like a pillar. Asher wiped his hands on his apron, took it off, hung it on a hook, and told the students to serve the feast. The feast was served on the world's last platform beneath the dead light of the junction. Tables were carried out from all the cars and arranged in 3 lines along the train. The students and volunteers rolled the cauldrons on the mechanics' carts, and white steam rose like a wall above the platform. Asher poured from the first cauldron himself. He looked at the faces in the line. The old woman who had been singing at the first communal table, the mechanic he had saved from black insomnia, Craig's orderlies with their identical bowls, the boys at the end of the line, Iva's people who were eating a hot meal from a real kitchen for the first time in 6 years, some of them with spoons trembling in their hands. 2,100 people ate for 1 hour. The display above the stove counted the diners, and when the counter reached the last one, the hearth flashed white light from all 34 windows of the car at once, so that the pale glow of the hub receded from the platform for a moment. The feast of the hearth had begun. It would last until dawn. Asher felt it as if it were a second skin. His body grew as solid as wood. The twilight brightened. The sound of his own footsteps fell silent, and yet he could sense everyone, not through thought, but as one senses the fingers of a single hand. 2,100 points of warmth all around, and each was a little bit of him, and he was a little bit of each. Pia, standing nearby, gasped and said she could hear the entire train breathing. Senta had set up the defenses in advance. The train formed the last line of defense. The cars stood as a wall, the mechanics' shields in the openings with white coal lamps every 10 paces. Kell took command of the defensive operations, his face pale and resolute. Ewell set up a field hospital in 3 cars. Craig took his position with his men on the left flank, and Asher watched as the merchant clumsily but diligently inspected his homemade spear. The creatures began to gather as dusk fell. They emerged from the wasteland by the hundreds and thousands, and the ring of their eyes encircled the platform. But the last platform had no features, and everyone understood that only one thing was holding them back for now. The faint light beckoned to them more strongly than any prey, for now it called. The squad left in complete darkness an hour before midnight. Ivo said that the faint light weakened by midnight when the canal drew in a breath. The hearth emerged from the rail car on its own. Asher opened the hatch and called to it, as one calls a dog with whom one has lived a lifetime, and the black, cast-iron beast rose from its spot as gently as a boat gliding over the shallows. It floated 1/2 meter above the ground. A white flame hummed steadily in its maw, and a dome of pure air extended 5 steps in every direction around it. 10 people entered the dome. Asher led the way, next to the stove. Ivo, with his staff, showed the way. Senta and the guards flanked them. Garm and the hunters brought up the rear. Odra carried the hooks. Pia held the oil lamp. Marin carried a box containing salt, herbs, and Tobias's knife, because Asher had said that one does not approach a castle warmed by a kitchen with empty hands. That kilometer of dim light turned out to be the longest journey of anyone's life. The light didn't shine. It weighed down on them. Beyond the dome's edge, the air quivered like jelly, and within it floated the shadows of the former people of the knot, those who hadn't managed to leave 6 years ago. They pressed against the dome from the outside, their faces gone, and Pia walked with her eyes shut, while Audra counted her steps aloud so as not to hear the shadows scraping. Halfway there, Garm made a sound that Asher had never heard from him before, a sob. Behind the dome, in the jelly, stood a shadow with 2 missing fingers on its left hand, just like Garm himself, and Evo sternly told them not to look, saying that the dim light revealed to each of them their own fear, and urged them forward. The depot rose from the glow like a black mountain. The gates had been torn down from the inside back on that very first night. The hearth glided under the arches, and the dim light remained outside, just as rain remains outside a door. Inside, it was dark and quiet, and a dome of white fire illuminated the rusty platforms. And on one of them stood the very thing that had brought the squad to a halt, a wooden car, an old model, charred to a cinder but still intact in shape, the twin of Car 34. Evo took off his hat. He said that the letter car hadn't vanished into the wasteland. The letter car had returned. The dead crew had brought it back to the junction in the very first year, but without a keeper, the lock was dead metal, and then the train left again, to find the one who would awaken the bearer, to gather the living, to build a kitchen. 6 years. Asher stood before the charred rail car and realized he was looking at the spot where the former keeper, whose name no one knew, had died. They found the descent to the lower level past the turntable. A wide ramp wound its way down, and the light from the hearth led the way, illuminating the walls, on which chalk inscriptions appeared more frequently the lower they went. Calculations, formulas, and then just words. Holding on, it's holding, I'm holding. Evo said it was the handwriting of engineer Calm, the one who had died in their village. Calm had gone down here alone during the first month and returned with gray hair, remaining silent until his death. On the 4th turn, the torch came to a stop. Ahead, the ramp was blocked, not by a collapse, by roots. Veins of the same gelatinous substance as outside, but dense as cartilage, sprang from the walls in the vault, and these veins quivered in unison, a slow, dead rhythm, a thud from within, the very same one that the seismologists of the old world had heard. Marin whispered that it had grown through the level like a mushroom through a plank. Garm stepped forward with his cleaver, but Evo grabbed his arm and said they couldn't cut it, that Calm had written it down. The pale light senses the pain of its roots, and then the whole knot will turn its gaze this way. The squad stood before a living wall, and then Asher did what he did best in the world. He turned to Marin and ordered him to open the box. He told the squad something that made Senta's eyebrow twitch and caused Audra to laugh for the first time that night. He said that if this filth couldn't be cut, then it could be tried for cooking. The veins were made of the same stuff as the creatures, and the seal had been feeding on those creatures for 6 years. The brazier floated up to the day. Asher placed his palm on the warm cast iron and asked as one might ask an old friend. A white flame stretched out from the mouth, not as a torch, but as a broad, soft tongue, and settled on the roots like heat settling on a cut of meat. There was no smell of burning. There was the smell of a kitchen, a rich, meaty, honest smell of broth, and the tendons beneath the flame did not char, but softened, lightened, thinned, and dripped from the stone like fat from a skillet. The hearth was eating. The ramp opened up, turn after turn, and the squad marched past the hearth in a cloud of aroma that made all 10 of them salivate. And this simple human reaction, in the midst of the underworld, brought them more relief than any words could. At the final turn, the roots ended. Below lay a circular hall hewn into the rock, and in its center, atop a black metal pedestal, the first half of the castle awaited them. A ring as tall as a man, with a nest in the middle. The nest was the size of a large frying pan, and a pattern resembling a tongue of flame ran along its edge. And behind the ring, a channel occupied the entire far wall of the hall, a fissure in the rock from which a faint light streamed, and in whose depths, in time with the flickering light,
pounded whatever was spilling beneath the world. The hearth stood before the ring, and for the first time in 6 years, its white flame roared loudly, like the hum of a stove when the main course is finally placed upon it. Asher approached the ring first. Up close, it was clear that the black metal of the pedestal wasn't smooth, but was covered with tiny marks, just as the margins of a notebook are filled with writing. Ivo ran his finger over the marks and said they were the engineer's installation markings. Ordinary human markings. Top. Bottom. Do not tilt. At the sight of these mundane words at the edge of the fissure, everyone found it a little easier to breathe. The socket in the center of the ring was waiting. Asher looked at the stove. The stove looked back at him with all its burners, if one can say that about a stove, and Asher could. The table he was used to seeing on the kitchen wall materialized right in the air above the cast iron. The carrier arrived at the lock. To join the two halves, the keeper must surrender the carrier. The seal will pass into the castle. The kitchen will remain a kitchen. The keeper will remain the keeper. The warmth remains where it was given. Asher reread the lines 3 times and realized that the hearth was saying goodbye. The seal, the miracle that healed and nourished, would go into the castle in its entirety. The stove in car number 34 would once again become just a stove, just like in the old world. He placed his palm on the cast iron and held it there for a long time. Then he said aloud that everything was as it should be. A miracle must be devoted to its primary purpose, and people can be fed even without a miracle. He had learned this 6 years before the catastrophe.
The connection began on its own. The hearth floated toward the ring. The damper bearing the mark separated from the cast iron without a sound and hung in the air, and the white flame flowed after it from the mouth of the hearth in its entirety, down to the very last tongue of fire. The damper settled into its socket. The pattern matched the pattern, and the hall trembled. A faint light surged from the fissure and thickened. The thudding from the depths shifted from a dead rhythm to a rapid one. Whatever was awakening sensed the shudder. Ivo shouted that the channel had understood and was summoning its own, and from above, from the ramp, came the sound the squad had hoped not to hear, the screech of thousands of legs. The faint light released the creatures from the platform and hurled them this way. Up above, by the train, at that very moment, Senta's defenses withstood the first and last assault of the night, because not all the creatures had retreated to the depot. Asher sensed this through the pier network. Distant stings from strangers' wounds, divided among 2,000. The platform held. Kel held the kitchen. Craig held the flank. Asher exhaled and turned to his men. "The lock is assembled," he said. "All that's left is to pull the trigger." The table now hung above the ring, its final lines glowing. The shutter is ready. Closing the channel requires a single burst of living heat. The required amount is unknown. The keeper turns the valve. Those giving off heat do so voluntarily. Coercion nullifies the heat. Senta asked matter-of-factly how they would give it off. Asher said it seemed to work the same way as when they ate, through the feasts network. Anyone who wished to would simply send their heat through the network to the castle. No one knew how much the barrier would take. Perhaps fatigue, perhaps years, perhaps lives. Marin suddenly said quietly that he understood why the feast was really needed. Not for battle. The feast had united everyone so that each could reach this far with their heat. From the very beginning, the hearth had been brewing not weapons but a single communal cauldron for all of humanity that remained. There was no time left for decisions. The creatures surged down the ramp. A bone dog was the first to burst into the hall, and Garm took it down mid-leap. Behind the dog came hunters, gaunt shadows, and horned silhouettes in a continuous stream. The 10 formed a semicircle in front of the ring. They fought like never before in their lives, because the feast held them all together. The creatures' blows split into 2,000 and landed as mere scratches. Stone-like steadfastness held their bones together. Pia's lamp burned away the shadows. Odra worked with her hooks as if butchering. Senta fired so that every round was a creature. But the stream didn't end. The creatures climbed over their own fallen comrades, and the semicircle contracted toward the ring step by step. And then Asher realized realized they couldn't wait for the battle to end. They had to turn the tide right now, in the thick of the fight, because later there might be no one left to do it. He shouted to Senta that he was starting. Senta nodded and bellowed for her people to maintain the dome around the keeper. Asher grabbed the shutter in its socket with both hands. The metal was warm, like the side of a stove in the evening. He closed his eyes and reached out through Pier's network, up toward the platform, and he called out. He wasn't good at giving speeches, so he didn't give one. He simply revealed to all 2,100 points of heat what he himself saw. The hall, the rift, a knock from inside, the lock that would seal it away forever, and himself by the lock. The cook who had been serving them soup for 6 years and now, for the first time, stood there himself with an empty bowl. He asked as they ask in the kitchen, "Who can share?" And the train answered. The first to give warmth was the one Asher hadn't expected, Craig. The merchant standing on the sidelines among his clerks was the first to give, and he gave not a drop, but a torrent, like a man who had saved his whole life and finally found merchandise worthy of his entire cash register. The rest followed in a flood. Odra sensed her own people and laughed through her tears, never stopping her hooking. Then the guards, then the mechanics, the teach, the plow hunters, the residents of the living sections, and the people of Iva. Kel gave so much that Asher feared for the boy and held back his flow as one would hold back a boiling cauldron. Ewell gave while simultaneously cursing over the comm, insisting that, as a medic, he was obligated to warn everyone of the consequences. The old woman who had been singing on the platform gave off warmth with her song, and all 2,000 heard that song over the network. The warmth flowed through Asher into the valve, and the valve began to turn. It was heavy, like a millstone, a quarter turn. The fissure howled with a faint light. The tapping from inside turned into blows. Something on the other side was pounding against the channel with all its might, sensing that it was being sealed off. A third of a turn. Asher's vision darkened, and he sensed that the shutter was absorbing not only the heat sent to it, but also his own. Years. He felt his years slipping away and couldn't measure how many. Half a turn. The creatures in the hall went mad and rushed not at the fighters but at the ring, and a dozen lay down in their path like a wall. Pia burned like a torch in both her hands. Marin silently shielded Asher's back with his own body and took the blow from the hunter, which spread across the net as scratches affecting 2,000 people and left a single deep wound on Marin himself, because he had stood too close to the castle, where the connection was weakening. He sank to the floor, clutching his side, and rasped to Asher not to turn around and to keep fighting. 2/3 of a turn. The train's warmth began to fade. The people had given so much that on the platform, the fighters were sitting down on the ground in the middle of the battle, overcome by a sudden wave of old age fatigue, and the gate kept taking it all. And then a heat entered the grid that hadn't been factored into the calculations. Alien, ancient. From the charred wooden car up above in the depot, a stream of heat came through the connection, like from a furnace, red hot from 6 years of waiting, and Asher felt it before he understood it. The former guardian. What remained of him in the burnt-out vessel. All this time, it had been waiting not for death, but for a change. It gave everything at once. The damper slid open easily. A full turn. The pounding from inside rose to a roar and then cut off. The breech snapped shut as silently as an eye closing. The dim light went out. All of it. At once. In the depot hall, above the wasteland and above the platform where 2,000 exhausted people saw, for the first time in 6 years, not a crimson glow, but a black sky overhead, and stars. The silence that followed the closure was unlike anything that ever happens. The creatures in the hall all stopped at once, frozen in mid-step. Then a shudder ran through their bodies, and they began to settle. Not to die, but specifically to settle, just as foam settles. The faint light that had held their form for 6 years dried up, and what had been flesh and bone trickled away and crumbled into gray dust. A minute later, the hall was empty, and only dust lay in waves all the way to the ramp. Garm lowered his cleaver and asked into the void, "Is that really all?" No one answered, for they feared the answer might scare them away. Asher released the latch. The latch had seized fast in the ring, and the pattern of flame on it went out. The lock became what it was meant to be, a solid door that could no longer be opened. Asher looked at his hands. They were his own hands, but something inside his body had shifted. He felt as though he'd lived an extra decade in a single heartbeat, and that decade had settled not as illness, but as gray hair and an inner silence. He didn't know how much time the lock had taken from him, or from anyone else, and he decided he wouldn't count it. In the kitchen, they don't count how much firewood has been burned if the bread is baked. Everyone rushed to Marin at once. The cook lay by the pedestal, pale and wet, and the wound in his side was nasty. The feast ended with the turn of the lock, and there was no one left to share his pain. Audra tore her jacket into strips. Pia held his head. Marin's eyes met Asher's, and he whispered that it seemed, for the first time in his life, he'd gotten to the stove just in time. All 10 of them took turns carrying him upstairs on a shield made of debris, and the cold, heavy hearth floated alongside them, fueled by the last crumbs of the seal's power still smoldering in the cast iron, as if seeing them off. At the exit of the depot, the squad stopped. Outside it was night, an ordinary black night with wind and stars, and a kilometer away, the train's lights were burning, living, red lights. Ivo stood in the doorway of the depot and wept openly, because for 6 years, he had only emerged from hiding under the dead light. The kilometer back took a long time, because they were carrying the wounded man, and because everyone's legs felt like cotton from the heat they'd given off. Halfway there, they were met. People ran from the train carrying lanterns and stretchers, and Kel was the first to arrive. He had abandoned the kitchen against all orders, and Asher couldn't bring himself to scold him. Yule took Marin off the platform and dragged him to the infirmary, snarling at anyone who got in his way. The platform looked like a field after the harvest. People sat and lay haphazardly amid extinguished cauldrons and gray waves of dust where the crumbled creatures had fallen, exhausted, aged overnight, and alive. Senta organized a guard, counted the train's complement, and went out to Asher with figures he would remember for the rest of his life. The night of the assault and the blockade cost the train 11 lives lost on the defensive line and 1 lost source of warmth. The old woman who had sung at the communal tables gave everything she had to the castle and died with a song over the feast's communication network, quietly and of her own free will. 11 and 1 out of 2,100 people on the night of the end of the world. Yule later said that, as a medic, he was obliged to call it a miracle, but he would call it the work of the kitchen. The morning did not dawn crimson. The sun rose over the wasteland, white and ordinary, and people looked at it as if it were a manifestation of beings beyond all rank. And then the train hummed, all on its own. For the first time in 6 years, the train made a sound, and from the lead car, with a steady hum, that very door, the one the welding hadn't been able to seal, swayed open. The mechanics, along with Senta and Asher, went inside armed and came out unarmed. There were no monsters behind the door. Behind the door was the engine room, where the heart of the train, a large machine without a firebox, was running smoothly and quietly. And in the room, at their posts, sat 3 more dead members of the Zarnitsa shift, their bodies mummified over the years at the controls. The final order had been carried out, and the machine was releasing them, and itself. On the control panel, a single lamp glowed above a lever with 2 positions: run and stop. The train no longer made any decisions on its own. Now it was up to the people. For 3 days, the train stood at the end of the tracks, coming to its senses. They buried the 11 and the old woman on the hill above the station, and for the first time in 6 years, they placed not stakes made from the creatures, but simply stones on the graves. The wasteland was silent. Garm's reconnaissance parties ventured farther and farther out, and returned with the same findings: dust, silence, and life, which was already feeling its way back into the world. Grass at the edges of the puddles. A single bird, the only real one, that the 3 of them had seen, but which no one believed until Pia brought back a feather. On the 3rd evening, the Quiet Council gathered in full force at the diner, along with Ivo and Craig, who had been invited without any arguments. There was only one question: what next? Ivo suggested staying at the junction where his settlement's fortifications and water were located. located. Botvin laid out the old maps and said that 3 days' journey south along the highway lay a key valley where, before the catastrophe, there had been fields, grain elevators, and a small town near the station. Land, real land under a real sky. They argued until nightfall. Audrey's words settled the matter. She said that the train had been an ark as long as there was water. The water was gone. The ark had to become a home, and you don't build a home on the threshold of a closed door, even if that door is locked forever. They voted openly, and no one raised a hand against it. The train traveled south for 3 days, and this was the first route in 6 years that the train had chosen on its own. The engineers drove the train, learning from the dead control panel as they went. They didn't stop at night because there was no reason to stop. Night became simply night. People were weaning themselves off their fear of sunset, and this weaning was a task in itself. Ewell walked through the cars, healing not wounds, but dreams. The valley opened up on the 3rd morning, and it was better than Botvin's maps. The river was alive. The fields were wild, but not dead. The little town by the station was empty and quiet, with roofs that had survived. The creatures hadn't touched it because there was no one left to take. People had left here of their own accord in the early days, heading for the major roads, and had vanished there, while their homes remained behind to wait. The train came to a stop at the overgrown platform of the Stettin, and 2,000 people stepped onto the ground that wasn't going anywhere. Many were staggering. Kell crouched down and touched the grass with his hand, as one might touch a sleeping beast. The resettlement took a week, and it was noisy, chaotic, and joyful. The groups divided up the houses by street. The tail of Odra took the eastern edge by the river, and no one dared to argue. The greenhouse Botvins had already dug into the fields, even before unpacking their belongings. Craig opened a shop in the old train station building, and on the very first day posted a notice that the debts of the train years were declared burned along with the old world. And Asher walked by and thought that the floodgate that night had melted away more than just the years. And car 34 remained standing where it had been. Asher went there every day. He stoked the cooled-down stove with ordinary firewood. The stove was now just a cast-iron stove, plain and honest, and the food cooked on it neither healed wounds nor lifted curses. The food cooked on it was simply delicious. Marin was on the mend, and from his cot oversaw the preparation of pickles for the winter. Pia was rewriting her recipe notebook in clean copy. Kell found a bakery in town, and on the 7th evening, when Asher lit the lamp above the counter out of habit, there was a knock at the train car door. Standing in the doorway was Senta, without her insignia, holding 2 cartridges in her palm. She asked if the place was still open because the whole town had been arguing for 3 days about where people would gather now, and this argument seemed silly to her. Asher looked past her. Along the overgrown platform, people were walking toward car 34, carrying spoons. The valley greeted its first winter with work. The town, which they simply called the station, was being built faster than expected because 2,000 people had been saving up their hunger for 6 years while going about their usual business. To the sound of carpenters' hammers, in the garden beds, in the right to lock their door from the inside, and know that no one would knock with a claw until morning. Asher ran a snack bar in the train car, and by the time the first snow fell, he realized the car was too small. People didn't just come to eat, people came to sit. The council, which had evolved from a quiet gathering into simply the station council, held its meetings at his place, gathered around pushed-together tables. Ewell held office hours at the counter, because the sick were more willing to go where it smelled of bread than where it smelled of an infirmary. Senta settled neighbors' disputes at the far table, and disputes were resolved twice as fast amid the scent of fried onions. By midwinter, Asher, along with his students and mechanics, had moved the kitchen into the building by the old train station, attaching car number 34 to it whole, as a hall. They left the rails under the car. Oda said that a house that had traveled to the end of the world was meant to stand on its own wheels. The whole town helped transport the stove on rollers, and the crowd walked alongside it as if following a banner. The stove was now just ordinary cast iron, but the station looked at it differently, and Asher stopped arguing with that gaze. Let them look. People need a place where their history stands. Life was learning to be simply life, and it was learning the hard way. In February, the first tragedy of the New World, one of the very old kind, occurred. 2 guys from West Street street got into a fight over a girl, and one stabbed the other. Yule pulled out the wounded man, and Station walked around dejected for 3 days, because for 6 years, people had been dying from beasts and had forgotten that they were capable of killing one another themselves. They held a trial in the diner. Senta demanded banishment. Odra said that banishment in an empty world is a death sentence, and the tale knows this better than anyone. They argued until they were hoarse, and then Craig stood up and proposed what was later enshrined as Station's first law. The guilty party is not banished, but must work off his debt. 1 year of the hardest labor under supervision, with half of his earnings going to the injured man's family. A punishment that builds rather than erases. They voted. Thus, the station's first law came into being, and it was born at the very same tables where the 3 rules of the diner had once hung. In the spring, strangers arrived. Garm's patrol encountered a convoy of 4 wagons on the northern road, carrying 50 ragged people armed with whatever they could find. Survivors from the foothills. Their community had spent 6 years in the tunnels, and when the sky cleared, they set out toward the smoke and light. The station accepted them through Yule's quarantine and Asher's table, because the council had decreed that every newcomer should first receive a hot meal, and talk could come later. The caravan ate in silence, and the eldest caravan leader, an old man with a frostbitten face, asked after his 3rd bowl whether it was true what they said around the campfires along the northern roads, that the cook had extinguished the dim light. Asher replied that 2,000 people had extinguished the dim light with a single communal cauldron. The old man thought for a moment and said that, in fact, that sounded even more like the truth. Over the summer, it became clear that the foothills were not the end of the line. The world turned out to be more resilient than they'd thought. People emerged from the tunnels and cellars of distant farmsteads and made their way to where, according to rumors, there was a sky without a glow and bread. By fall, the station had grown to 3,000, and the council was already deliberating on matters that no one had dared to dream of for 6 years. A school, a mill, reconnaissance of neighboring valleys. The train stood at the platform and now served as a freight hauler. Mechanics drove the shortened train along the cleared main line south toward the Salt Lakes and north toward the forests, and Botvin plotted each trip on a new map he'd started from scratch. He gave the old map, with its jagged line of stops, to the school to teach the children about what had been, and in the fall, the hearth reminded him of itself. Asher stoked the stove at dawn as always, and when the fire caught on the soot-stained wall above the cast-iron stove, lines appeared in a single breath, pale as breath on glass. The seal has been restored in the hearth. The bearer thanks the keeper. The warmth is preserved. The door holds. The lines faded and never appeared again. Asher stood there for a long time with a log in his hand. Then he put the log in the fire and began kneading dough, because opening time was in an hour and the bread wouldn't bake itself. But that day, he gathered the old squad, all 9 of them, in the hall and recited the lines word for word. They were silent. Then Garm raised a mug of brew and proposed a toast that was later repeated at the station every anniversary: to the door that holds and to the warmth that is preserved. In the winter of the 2nd year, Evo Rat died, quietly in his sleep, in the house by the river, the very first house they'd built for him. The entire town of Station buried him, and on a stone they carved a symbol of a flame and the words he himself had chosen while still alive: I waited. At the memorial service in the diner, Asher heard a story from Evo's people that he hadn't known before. It turned out that for all 6 years in the settlement near the junction, Evo had set an extra bowl on the table every evening for the keeper who would one day arrive. Asher then stepped out onto the porch and stood there for a long time in the cold. Pia followed him out, draped a jacket over his shoulders, and asked him nothing, because over the years at the stove she had learned the most important art of cooking: to remain silent at the right moment. By that time, Pia was no longer an apprentice. That fall, in front of the entire dining hall, Asher took the brass key to car 34 from around his neck and hung it around hers, because the establishment needed 2 pairs of helping hands, and he had only 1. Kel took over the bakery. Marin stayed by the boilers, and his porridge still drew a line of people, though it cured nothing but a bad mood. Life went on, and only one thing had haunted Asher all these 2 years. Every few nights, he had the same old dream: the kitchen, the counter, and the creatures on the stools, meek and weary, waiting for food. The dream wasn't scary, but it was as persistent as an unfinished letter. Yule, to whom Asher once confided this over midnight tea, He said, as a doctor, that dreams were undigested daytime experiences. And as a person, he added that there was undigested 6-year-old trauma, that for 6 years, Asher had fed the living and fought the creatures, and not once had he had time to think about the fact that these creatures, according to Iva, had once been human, that the cook in him perhaps still considers them underfed guests, and that there's only one thing that helps with such accounts: to settle the score. In the spring of the 3rd year, Asher harnessed 2 horses from the station's overgrown stable, loaded a cauldron, a tripod, a sack of flour, salt, and dried meat onto a wagon, and told the council that he was going to the hub, alone. There's no reason for it, just to pay a debt, the council argued. Senta silently packed a second sack for him. It was quiet and clean at the Zarnitsa depot. The remains of the creatures had sunk into the ground over the past 2 years, and in place of the dim light, young, tough grass was growing green. The castle on the ledge stood cold and silent, and Asher descended to it, bowed to the ring, and climbed back up. And then, on the empty clearing in front of the depot gates, where, 6 years ago, all the roads of the old world had ended, he built a hearth out of stones, lit a fire, set the cauldron over it, and cooked a stew for 50 bowls, and set the table. Planks on the stones, bowls in a row, spoons. He sat down at the edge and said into the empty evening air that the establishment was open and that the first meal was on the house. The wind swept across the grass. No one came, and he knew no one would. He ate alone, washed the dishes, and lay down to sleep by the fire. And that night, he had that old dream for the last time. The kitchen, the counter, the stools, empty. 50 washed bowls stood on the counter, bottoms up, and on the inside of the door hung a sign that he himself had hung 1,000 times in the old world. Closed. Everyone had left satisfied. Asher woke up at dawn, and for the first time in 9 years, felt that it was quiet inside. Completely quiet. He broke camp, left 1 bowl and 1 spoon on the rocks by the depot gate, just in case, and turned the horses toward home. The road south was smooth, and weeds were blooming along the shoulders. Somewhere ahead, by the river, the chimney of the diner that Pia kept warm was smoking. The station was waiting for bread. 10 years had passed. The station had become a town, though it stubbornly continued to call itself the station. 5,000 residents, 3 streets of workshops, a mill by the river, and a 2-story school where the children knew Botvin's map with its jagged line of stops by heart, just as they had once known their prayers. The main line had been cleared for 300 versts in both directions, and the train ran on a schedule drawn up no longer by Botvin, but by his students, because the old dispatcher himself had retired and spent his days sitting on a bench outside the snack bar, arguing with Garm about whose youth had been harder. Around the station, settlements and farmsteads sprang up, as well as distant communities, and once a year, when the first snow fell, they all gathered in the main square by the building at the old station, with its attached car on the eternal tracks. The Day of the Gate. That was the name of this holiday, and it always began the same way, with a communal table stretching across the entire square, and a moment of silence for the 12 names read aloud by the children. Asher was approaching his 50s, and he was almost entirely gray-haired, because the lock had taken its toll that night, and no one could return the years he'd given to the castle. He had no regrets. In fact, as he grew older, he noticed that he had lost the ability to regret anything that had been spent wisely. The eatery had long since ceased to be his property. The council had bought it from him for the town's common use, yet they left him there as the very person he had always been, a cook. Pia managed the dining hall and the apprentices, of whom there were now 9. Kel ran the bakery and supervised 3 apprentices. Marin had grown old by the cauldrons, but he still cooked the same porridge, and young cooks from all over the valley came to learn from him specifically how to make porridge, because miracles are miracles, but taste is taste. Senta no longer commanded the guards, but oversaw the entire order of the city, and even in her 50s, she still shot better than anyone else the station had ever known. Odra became the elder of the East Bank, and her youngest children and grandchildren held the best fishing spots on the river. Yule trained 4 doctors, grumbled at all 5, including himself, and continued to jot down everything in his journal because, as he once said, a chronicle is just another bandage, but for time. Craig died in his 8th year, quietly, behind the counter of his shop, with a pen in his hand. His will contained something no one had expected from him. The merchant bequeathed all his property to the school with a single line of explanation: "The interest from the most successful deal of my life." What deal did he mean? The station argued about it for a month, but Asher didn't argue because he knew. On that day, the 10th anniversary, the square was covered with tables from the train station to the river. People came from the farmsteads and distant communities, as well as guests from south of the Salt Lakes, where their own young station had been built. Asher had been standing at the stove since dawn. That very one. The cast-iron beast had survived it all, and was now stoked with firewood like a simple stove, but station would only acknowledge shutdown day with food cooked on it, and Asher loved this quirk of the town. The 3 of them cooked together, just like in the old days, him, Pia, and Marin. Kel brought the bread. The young apprentices ran with pots to the square, and the oldest of the apprentices, a boy named Tobias, whom his mother had named after an old cook she herself knew only from stories, kept trying to stand by the main stove, and Asher wouldn't let him. By noon, the town had sat down to eat. Asher stepped out onto the porch with a ladle because, as was the custom, he was the one to pour from the first pot. He looked out at the square, at gray-haired Senta, surrounded by young guards, at Audra with her great-grandson on her lap, at the children who were born under a clear sky and knew creatures only from horror stories and their school maps, at the old rail car number 34, which had long since been turned into the station museum, and where, under glass, lay a brass key, a Zarnitsa depot token, a quartered notebook belonging to the quartermaster, and Pia's first recipe notebook with dog-eared corners. He poured the first pot of soup. Senta, as the senior-most member, stood up to say a few words and spoke, as always, briefly. She said that 10 years ago, 2,000 people decided that the warmth you give doesn't end but accumulates, and that the city stands on this law more firmly than on its foundations. Then they read the names, then they ate, and the square buzzed until sunset. And at sunset, the final miracle of this story took place, and it was a very small one. Asher, tired and content, returned to the empty kitchen to set the dough aside for tomorrow. The stove was cooling down, its cast iron parts clacking as they always did. He walked past it, carrying a tub of sourdough starter, and suddenly stopped. On the soot-stained wall above the stove, in the slanting evening light, old lines were visible. They weren't glowing, just a trace. Over the years of white fire, the letters of the seal had burned a shadow into the soot, and that shadow only emerged at this very hour of the evening, at this very angle. Asher had never noticed it before. He set down the cauldron and walked over. Only one line was legible, the very bottom one, the one he'd seen on that first evening 19 years ago, when he was broken, robbed, and condemned. The hearth accepts payment and dispatches orders. Asher stood there, looking at the shadow of the letters, and laughed quietly, the way one laughs with an old friend. Then he said aloud in the empty kitchen that the order had been fulfilled, all of it, down to the last bowl. That night, after the celebration, he didn't go home right away, but sat on the porch with a mug of broth. The river roared. Stars hung over the valley, stars to which, even after 10 years, those who remembered the crimson sky had never quite grown accustomed. Pia emerged from the darkness, sat down next to her mug, and they were silent in the way that people who've cooked together 1,000 pots know how to be silent. Then she asked what he was thinking about. Asher thought for a moment and answered honestly. He was thinking about how, in the old world, he'd been a cook at a late-night diner near the freight station, and had considered his life to be small. The stove, the counter, the night shift workers. Then the world ended, and it turned out that the only great thing he possessed was that very same ladle, and that it was enough. Enough for the train, enough for the gate, for the city. So, he said, there's no such thing as a small life. There are only underfed ones. Pia snorted into her mug and said that this should be written down on the first page of the notebook, and she wrote it down the next day. From then on, the station's notebook began with that phrase, and for many generations to come, cooks graduating from the school attached to the diner knew it before they knew their first recipe. Asher himself lived a long time after that. He lived to see Kel's grandchildren, the first train to the southern station, and the year when the birds returned to the valley in flocks rather than one by one. He kept getting up 2 hours before opening all his life and never learned to cook according to the notebook's measurements. Right up until his final years, he argued with Marin about salt. He died of old age at the end of winter, in his sleep, in the house by the river, and on his last evening, according to Pia, he did everything as usual. He kneaded the dough for the morning. He checked the coals. He hung his apron on a hook. The whole valley buried him, and on the stone next to the flame symbol, they carved not his rank or his achievements, but the words with which he himself greeted everyone entering car 34, through all the years of the train and all the years of the town. Every child at the station knows these words, and any story about the era of the train begins with them, because, by general consensus, they encapsulate the entire history. Come sit at the table. There's something hot to eat.